On September 7th, 1566, a Croatian nobleman named Miklos Zrinski put on his finest Magyar coat, slipped the keys to his own castle into his pocket, and led roughly 300 men out of a burning fortress into the teeth of an Ottoman army that still numbered in the tens of thousands. He knew he would die. He had known for weeks. What makes this moment extraordinary is not the charge itself, but the fact that the empire he was charging against was being commanded, at that very hour, by a dead man. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, 71 years old and the longest reigning sovereign in Ottoman history, had died in his tent the night before, and his Grand Vizier was forging orders under a dead sultan's seal to hold the army together long enough to take one small fortress that most of Europe had already given up for lost. Here is the question that drives everything you are about to witness. How did 2,300 defenders behind wooden palisades and marshy ditches hold the most powerful siege army on earth for 33 days? And why did those 33 days matter more than any battle the Habsburgs fought that year? This is the full reconstruction. Not a summary, not a highlight reel, not the famous last charge stripped from its context. We are going to rebuild this siege from its first cause to its last consequence, and we are going to do it the way it actually unfolded, without the comfort of knowing how it ends. We begin decades before the first Ottoman cannon was dragged into position in the wreckage of Mohacs, where Hungary was broken in a single afternoon in 1526 and never truly reassembled. We trace how the Ottoman frontier crept northwest across the Hungarian plain, how the Habsburgs inherited a kingdom they could not defend, and how the border became a world of its own, populated by fortress garrisons who lived and fought by rules that Vienna barely understood. We examine the two war machines that will collide at Szigetvár. On one side, roughly 100,000 men, Janissaries trained from boyhood, Sipahi cavalry, specialist sappers who could tunnel under any wall, and an artillery train capable of reducing stone to gravel. On the other, 2,300 Croatian and Hungarian frontier soldiers armed with arquebuses and swords, men who knew every causeway, every water channel, every timber wall of a fortress built in 3 concentric layers on a marshy island. We follow Suleiman's decision to march one last time, an old sultan racked by illness who could no longer ride a horse, but refused to let his empire's momentum die with him. We walk beside his army through the summer rains that turned roads to mud and slowed the advance by weeks. We sit in Maximilian II's war council in Vienna, where the Habsburg emperor gathered the largest field army he would ever command, and then did nothing with it, leaving Zrinski to face the full weight of the Ottoman offensive alone. Then we enter the siege itself, day by day, perimeter by perimeter. The old town bombarded and stormed, the new town defended with fire, with sorties, with flooding. The inner castle, the last rectangle of earth and timber, where Zrinski's dwindling garrison counted their remaining rounds and held a final council of war. And through it all, the causeways, those narrow land bridges connecting each defensive zone, fought over, destroyed, rebuilt, and crossed again, the choke points where numbers meant less than nerve. We witness what happened inside the imperial tent when Suleiman's breath stopped, and how Sokolu Mehmed Pasha sealed the tent, silenced the physicians, and kept an empire of 100,000 soldiers believing their sultan still lived. We reconstruct Zrinski's final morning and the explosion that followed, when a powder magazine buried beneath the inner castle detonated and killed hundreds of the very soldiers who thought they had won. and then we measure the cost. Perhaps 20 to 30,000 Ottoman casualties for a fortress most courts considered expendable. A campaign season spent. Vienna never reached. The last great western offensive of the Ottoman Empire ground to a halt not by a rival army, but by time itself, time purchased with lives in a place called Szigetvár. This story lives today in three nations' memories. Hungarians and Croatians remember Zrinyi as a martyr. Turkish tradition honors Suleiman's final march as the last campaign of a golden age. Archaeologists have found the site where his tent likely stood. We will show you what the evidence confirms and where legend has painted over the gaps, because the documented truth is more extraordinary than any myth. If you value complete reconstructions of the sieges and battles that decided the fate of empires, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each time we take one legendary clash and rebuild it hour by hour, the strategy, the commanders, and the decisions that changed the world. Let us begin where this story truly begins, not at the walls of Szigetvár, but 40 years earlier, on a field in southern Hungary where a kingdom died in a single afternoon. On the morning of August 29th, 1526, the Kingdom of Hungary ceased to exist as a great power. It took roughly 90 minutes. The plain of Mohács, a flat expanse of late-summer farmland near the Danube in southern Hungary, became the graveyard of a medieval order that had endured for 5 centuries. King Louis II, 20 years old, led perhaps 25,000 men, armoured knights, feudal levies, a scattering of mercenaries, against an Ottoman army more than twice that size under Sultan Suleiman I. The Hungarian heavy cavalry charged into disciplined ranks of Janissary infantry supported by massed cannon. The charge broke. The king drowned fleeing through a swollen creek, weighed down by his armor. 7 bishops, 500 nobles, and roughly 15,000 soldiers fell with him. By nightfall, Hungary had no king, no army, and no coherent political will to resist what came next. What came next was partition. Suleiman did not annex Hungary outright, not immediately. He installed a vassal king, János Zápolyai, and withdrew. But the rival claim of Archduke Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother-in-law to the dead Louis, split the kingdom into warring factions. For 15 years Hungary bled between 2 masters. Then in 1541, Suleiman returned, this time to stay. Ottoman troops occupied Buda, the ancient capital, without a siege. The great cathedral on Castle Hill heard the call to prayer. Hungary's heartland, the fertile Danubian plain, the crossroads of Central Europe, became an Ottoman province administered from Buda by a pasha, garrisoned by janissaries, taxed by Ottoman clerks. What remained of Hungary fractured into 3 pieces: the Ottoman centre, Royal Hungary in the north and west, a narrow strip clinging to Habsburg protection, and Transylvania in the east, a semi-autonomous principality paying tribute to the Sultan. The frontier between Ottoman and Habsburg Hungary was not a line on a map, but a zone, a scarred belt of burned villages, wooden stockades, and watchtowers stretching from the Adriatic coast northeast to the Carpathians. Along this frontier, a distinct military culture took root. Croatian and Hungarian border lords maintained small professional garrisons in fortresses built not of stone, but of earth, timber, and water. They fought a permanent low-intensity war of raids, ambushes, and seasonal skirmishes against Ottoman frontier forces, doing exactly the same from the other side. Vienna watched and calculated. The Habsburgs understood that Hungary's ruin served, paradoxically, as their shield. Every fortress that held, every raid that cost Ottoman Sipahis a week of marching, bought time for the empire's western defences. But Vienna would not commit to reconquest. The expense was staggering. The Protestant Reformation fractured imperial unity, and French diplomacy actively courted the Sultan against Habsburg interests. Emperor after emperor promised relief to the frontier lords and delivered less than promised. The border garrisons learned a bitter arithmetic. They would be praised, underfunded, and expected to die in place. By the 1560s, the frontier had hardened into a system, imperfect, brutal, and indispensable. Fortresses like Gyula, Eger, Palota, and Szigetvár formed a loose chain across southwestern Hungary. Their commanders were men who understood that no single fortress could stop an Ottoman field army. The purpose was delay. Every week an Ottoman siege force spent reducing a frontier fort was a week subtracted from the campaigning season, a week closer to autumn rains and impassable roads, a week further from Vienna. The mathematics of sacrifice were understood by every garrison captain along the line. Among those captains, one name carried particular weight. Count Nikola Zrinski, Ban of Croatia, great-grandson of a hero of the earlier Ottoman wars, held Szigetvár, a fortress of wooden walls and earthen ramparts built on a marshy island in the Almas Creek Valley. He had defended this frontier for years. He knew its terrain, its limitations, and its single strategic virtue. It sat directly across the military road from Belgrade to Vienna. Any Ottoman army marching northwest would either take Szigetvár or leave a hostile garrison on its supply line. And in the spring of 1566, the oldest and most powerful sultan in Ottoman history began assembling the largest army he had ever led. That army had not marched in force toward Central Europe for over a decade. The empire's energies had turned eastward, toward Persia, and inward, toward succession crises that had consumed Suleiman's later reign. 2 of his sons were dead by his order. A third, Selim, waited in Anatolia as the designated heir, a prince whose reputation for wine and indolence worried the court, but whose survival depended entirely on his father's continued authority. Suleiman understood that an empire built on conquest could not afford to stop conquering. The Janissary Corps, the Sipahi cavalry, the provincial governors who owed their positions to plunder and promotion, all of these required the forward motion of war. A sultan who sat idle in Istanbul risked the same fate he had inflicted on his own sons. By the winter of 1565, intelligence from the Hungarian frontier confirmed what Suleiman's strategists already suspected. Habsburg garrisons had been reinforced. The fortress line was thickening. Count Nikola Zrinski had conducted aggressive raids into Ottoman-held territory, burning supply depots and ambushing patrols with a boldness that bordered on provocation. The border was not quiet. It was hardening. And every year it hardened further reduced the likelihood that a future campaign could break through cheaply. The decision crystallized in the early months of 1566. Suleiman would lead the army himself. This was not ceremonial. Ottoman military tradition demanded that the Sultan's presence sanctify a major campaign, and Suleiman had led armies since his 20s. Belgrade in 1521, Rhodes in 1522, Mohacs in 1526, the first siege of Vienna in 1529. But the man who issued the order in 1566 bore little resemblance to the warrior of those earlier decades. He was 71 years old. Chronic gout had swollen his joints to the point where he could no longer ride a horse for extended periods. Ottoman court physicians attended him constantly. A specially constructed carriage would carry him on the march, and his imperial tent, an enormous pavilion of silk and felt, capable of housing a full war council, would serve as both command post and sick room. The mobilization that spring transformed Istanbul into a staging ground of extraordinary scale. Ottoman chronicler Selanik'i recorded the assembly. Janissary regiments drilling in the hippodrome, artillery pieces drawn from the imperial arsenal at Tofane, thousands of camels loaded with powder and shot, engineers gathering timber and rope for siege works not yet designed. The army that gathered numbered approximately 100,000 men, though modern historians place the effective combat strength somewhat lower, perhaps 70 to 80,000, with the remainder comprising camp followers, drivers, and support personnel. The artillery train alone required weeks to move, heavy bronze siege guns, each weighing several tons, dragged by teams of oxen along roads that turned to mud in spring rain. On the 1st of May, 1566, the imperial standard was raised before the Topkapi Palace. Suleiman emerged to review his troops. According to the Ottoman court record, he was carried to his observation point. The army that filed past him stretched for miles along the road leading west through Thrace. Somewhere in that column rode Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, the Grand Vizier, the man who would manage the campaign's daily operations and who carried the administrative weight of the empire on the march. Sokolu was a converted Christian from Bosnia, risen through the Devshirme system to the highest office beneath the Sultan. Brilliant, ruthless, and acutely aware that his master might not survive the journey. The stated objective was Vienna. The practical objective was more flexible. Suleiman's war council understood that reaching Vienna required securing the fortress corridor through Hungary, and that meant reducing any stronghold that threatened the army's supply line. The road from Belgrade ran northwest through Pec, and then onward toward Buda and beyond. Szigetvár lay just west of that road, close enough to menace any column passing north. Whether the Sultan intended from the start to besiege it, or whether events on the march would force the decision remained, in those first days of May, an open question. The column moved west, and with it moved the last campaign season the Ottoman Empire would ever spend trying to reach the heart of Europe. The column that wound its way out of Istanbul in the spring of 1566 was not merely an army. It was a mobile state, a self-sustaining organism of conquest refined across 2.5 centuries of continuous warfare, and understanding how it functioned is essential to understanding why Szigetvár's resistance was so extraordinary. At its core marched the Janissary infantry, perhaps 12 to 15,000 strong for this campaign. These were professional soldiers recruited through the Devshirme system, taken as boys from Christian communities across the Balkans, converted and trained from childhood in a regimen that produced arguably the finest infantry in the 16th century world. They drilled with the arquebus and the composite bow. They fought behind field fortifications as readily as they stormed walls. Their discipline under fire was legendary. Ottoman chronicles and European observers alike noted that Janissary formations could absorb volleys and hold position while other troops broke. They were salaried, quartered in barracks during peacetime, and organized into units called ortas, each roughly 100 to 300 men, commanded by officers who had risen through the same system. Around the Janissary corps rode the Sipahis, the feudal cavalry of the empire. These were landholders who owed military service in exchange for their estates, called timars. A Sipahi arrived with his own horse, his own weapons, and often one or more retainers. The Sipahi cavalry of Rumelia and Anatolia together could field tens of thousands of horsemen, though not all served on every campaign. For 1566, estimates suggest between 30 and 50,000 mounted troops of various categories accompanied the army, including the elite household cavalry of the Sultan's court. They screened the march, raided ahead of the column, and delivered the shock charges that could shatter a weakened line. But the arm that made the Ottoman army the supreme siege force of its age was neither infantry nor cavalry. It was the engineering and artillery corps. Ottoman sappers, specialists in mining, trenching, and earthwork construction, could approach a fortress through parallel trenches, dig tunnels beneath walls, pack them with gunpowder, and bring down masonry that had stood for centuries. The artillery train for a major campaign included bombards capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, alongside lighter field guns and mortars. Moving this train required thousands of draft animals, dedicated roads, and an immense logistical tail. Contemporary estimates suggest the full column, including camp followers, engineers, laborers, and supply personnel, stretched for miles along the road. Feeding this organism demanded a commissariat that operated on a continental scale. Grain depots were established along the march route months in advance. Herds of livestock moved with the army. River transport supplemented overland supply where possible. The system was efficient, but not infinite. It was calibrated to the campaigning season, which in Hungary ran from roughly June through October. Every week spent reducing a fortress was a week subtracted from the window of operations, and every week consumed thousands of pounds of grain, fodder, and powder that could not be easily replaced in the field. This was the instrument Sokolu Mehmed Pasha managed and directed beneath the Sultan's nominal command. It was vast, experienced, and superbly organized. It had taken Belgrade, Rhodes, and Baghdad. It had shattered the Hungarian army at Mohacs in a single afternoon. Its sappers had breached walls across 3 continents. No fortress in Hungary had held against it for more than a few weeks when the full weight of the empire was committed. Yet the machine had vulnerabilities that its magnificence concealed. Its size made it slow. Its supply chain made it dependent on time. Its morale depended on the Sultan's visible presence and the promise of victory before winter. And in 1566, the Sultan who held it all together could barely ride a horse. The army marching northwest carried within it both overwhelming power and a ticking clock, and somewhere ahead, behind wooden palisades and marsh water, a garrison of 2,300 men was preparing to make that clock the only weapon that mattered. That fortress sat where no fortress should have thrived, and where every fortress needed to be. Szigetvár occupied a marshy island in the Almas Creek Valley of southwestern Hungary, a landscape of shallow water, soft ground, and reeds that turned the surrounding terrain into a natural moat for most of the year. The name itself carried the logic of the place, Sziget meaning island in Hungarian. What the Ottomans would face was not a single castle, but a layered defensive system of 3 concentric zones, each separated from the next by water, each connected to the next by a single narrow causeway that could be swept by fire from both sides. The outermost ring was the old town, a civilian settlement enclosed by wooden palisades reinforced with packed earth, the standard frontier construction of the Hungarian borderlands, where stone was scarce, but timber and labor were not. These walls would not stop a cannonball the way dressed stone might, but packed earth absorbed impact, deforming rather than shattering, and could be repaired overnight by determined hands. Beyond the old town's perimeter lay the marshland itself, crossable only along prepared approaches that any defender could predict, and any attacker would have to force under fire. Behind the old town, across a causeway perhaps 40 paces long, stood the new town, a smaller, tighter enclosure with its own palisades, its own earthworks, and better fields of fire. This was the intermediate position, the fallback that would compress the defense but also concentrate its firepower. And behind the new town, across a second causeway, rose the inner castle on its own island, the final redoubt, with a stone tower, a small courtyard, powder magazines, and the last reserves of water and ammunition. Each zone was designed to be surrendered in sequence, each withdrawal buying time while forcing the attacker to begin siege operations anew against a fresh perimeter. The man responsible for this defense was Count Nikola Zrinski, a Croatian-Hungarian nobleman in his late 50s who had spent his adult life on the military frontier. He was Ban of Croatia, a title carrying both civil authority and military command, and he understood the arithmetic of border warfare with brutal clarity. His garrison numbered approximately 2,300 men, Croats and Hungarians, professional frontier soldiers who lived in a permanent state of low-intensity war with Ottoman raiding parties. These were not conscript peasants. They were men who knew how to handle an arquebus, how to fight from behind a palisade, how to sortie at night and withdraw before dawn. Many had served at Szigetvár for years and knew every timber, every angle of fire, every soft patch of ground where a sapper's tunnel might be driven. Their weapons reflected the hybrid warfare of the frontier. Arquebuses and a modest number of heavier guns gave them ranged killing power from the walls. Swords, polearms, and close-quarter experience made them dangerous in the tight spaces of causeway fighting. They had stores of pitch, oil, and combustible materials for fire defense, a weapon that wooden palisades made terrifyingly double-edged. They had gunpowder, though not unlimited quantities, and they had something no supply wagon could carry. The knowledge, confirmed by every messenger who failed to arrive, that Emperor Maximilian II was gathering forces far to the north, but had no intention of risking them in a relief march. Zrinski knew this. His officers knew this. The garrison knew this. The fortress was not designed to be held indefinitely. It was designed to be expensive, to cost the attacker weeks, thousands of men, and the irreplaceable currency of summer days. Every causeway crossing denied, every night sortie that forced the Ottomans to repair their trenches, every mine that had to be dug through waterlogged soil, added weight to the only strategic calculation that mattered. Somewhere to the northwest, Vienna stood behind its own walls, and between Vienna and the Ottoman column lay the calendar itself, turning slowly toward autumn rains and impassable roads. The garrison of Szigetvár did not need to win. It needed to last. And in the first days of August, as scouts reported dust clouds on the southern horizon, and the ground began to tremble faintly with the vibration of tens of thousands of marching feet, the men on the palisades checked their powder, tested their match cords, and watched the approaches across the marsh. The column had left Istanbul in the first days of May, but the army that would arrive before Szigetvár in August was not the same force that crossed the Bosphorus. It was slower, heavier, and led by a man who could no longer ride. The march northwest followed the established Ottoman military road through the Balkans, a route surveyed, bridged, and provisioned across 2 centuries of imperial campaigning. From Istanbul, the line of advance ran through Edirne, then northwest across Thrace into the Serbian lands, through Sofia and Niš, then north toward Belgrade, the great forward base on the Danube that Suleiman himself had captured 45 years earlier. The distance from Istanbul to Belgrade alone measured roughly 600 miles. For a column of perhaps 100,000 men, combat troops, camp followers, engineers, artillery teams, and the vast logistical tail of pack animals, grain wagons, and powder carts, the rate of march rarely exceeded 10 miles per day. On good roads in dry weather, the vanguard might manage 12. But the summer of 1566 did not offer good weather. Rain began falling in June and did not relent. Ottoman chroniclers recorded weeks of downpour that turned roads into channels of mud, swelled rivers beyond their fords, and forced the engineering corps to rebuild bridges that had served previous campaigns without incident. The artillery train suffered most. The heaviest siege guns, bronze pieces weighing several tons, dragged on reinforced carriages by teams of oxen and buffalo, sank axle-deep in softened ground. Entire days were lost extracting a single cannon from a mud-hole while the rest of the column compressed behind it, units stacking into each other, forage parties competing for the same stripped fields. Suleiman travelled in a carriage. Ottoman court historians noted this with careful restraint, but the fact itself was extraordinary. The Sultan, who had ridden at the head of 13 campaigns, who had personally directed sieges from Rhodes to Baghdad, now required a covered wagon fitted for an invalid. He suffered from gout so severe that mounting a horse had become impossible. Some sources suggest intestinal illness as well. His physicians attended him constantly. The imperial tent was erected each evening with the same ceremony, the same guard rotations, the same protocol of audiences, but the audiences grew shorter, and fewer commanders were admitted. The army reached Belgrade in early July, already weeks behind the schedule that a Vienna campaign demanded. Here the War Council convened, and here the campaign's trajectory changed. The original strategic objective, whether it was truly Vienna or always something more limited, remains debated by historians. What is documented is that at Belgrade, or possibly shortly after, the decision crystallized to strike Szigetvár first. The fortress had raided Ottoman supply lines, its commander had defied imperial authority, and it sat astride the northwestern road in a position that could not be safely bypassed with a hostile garrison intact in the army's rear. From Belgrade, the column turned northwest into the Hungarian lowlands, crossing the Drava River on pontoon bridges laid by the engineering corps. The rain continued. Wagons broke. Horses went lame on roads that had dissolved into trenches of clay. The Janissaries marched in disciplined files, their equipment carried on their backs, but even elite infantry slowed when every step required pulling a foot from sucking earth. The Sipahi cavalry, spread across the flanks as screens and foraging parties, found the countryside partially stripped. Local populations had fled or hidden their grain. By late July, the vanguard elements were probing toward Szigetvár's outer approaches, and scouts brought back descriptions of the marshland, the palisades, the flooded ground. Behind them, strung out across miles of ruined road, the main body continued its grinding advance. And in his carriage, behind curtains that hid his condition from the ranks, the Sultan, who had remade the map of 3 continents, was carried forward toward a fortress he would never enter, issuing orders in a voice that grew quieter with each passing week. 6 marches to the northwest, behind the walls of Vienna, behind the further walls of protocol and council and counter-council, Emperor Maximilian II held the power to change everything and did almost nothing with it. This was not cowardice in the simple sense. It was something more corrosive, a paralysis born of competing fears, each one rational enough to justify inaction for another week, another dispatch, another convened war council that ended without resolution. The Habsburg military position in the summer of 1566 was not hopeless. Maximilian had been assembling forces since spring. Imperial diet levies, German mercenary infantry, Hungarian noble cavalry, and contingents from allied princes were converging on staging areas in western Hungary and around Vienna itself. By late July, the emperor could count roughly 80,000 men under arms or en route, a force that, on paper, could contest the Ottoman advance. But paper armies and field armies are different creatures. The German Landsknecht companies arrived at different speeds, with different contracts, different expiration dates for their service. The Hungarian magnates who brought cavalry brought also their own strategic opinions, and those opinions pointed in every direction at once. Some urged an immediate march south to relieve the frontier fortresses. Others insisted the army must remain concentrated near Vienna, refusing to risk a pitched battle that, if lost, would leave the capital naked. Maximilian listened to all of them. He agreed with the last man who spoke. He wrote letters to the Pope, to Philip II of Spain, to German princes still mustering, requesting more troops, more money, more time. Time was the one commodity Miklos Zrinski did not have, and every courier who rode south from the imperial camp carried, beneath its diplomatic language, the same message. Hold, endure. No relief column is coming yet. Zrinski understood this arithmetic with the clarity of a man who had spent his life on the frontier. He had written to Maximilian. He had written to fellow border lords. The responses were sympathetic and empty. The fortress would fight with what it had. 2,300 men. The ammunition in its magazines, the grain in its storehouses, and the water that surrounded it. No army would appear on the southern horizon to break the Ottoman siege lines. The question was never whether Szigetvár could be saved. The question was how many days it could be made to cost. And so Zrinski made his calculation. Every day the Ottoman army spent reducing his walls was a day subtracted from the campaigning season. Every assault that required preparation, every trench that had to be dug through waterlogged ground, every mine that had to be driven through marshy soil consumed Ottoman time, Ottoman powder, Ottoman lives. September rains would turn the roads to rivers. October would make further advance impossible. If Szigetvár could hold into September, the fortress would die, but Vienna would live. The mathematics were brutal and precise. He gathered his garrison commanders in the inner castle and laid the situation before them without ornament. There would be no relief. There would be no negotiated surrender. Zrinski had seen what Ottoman terms meant for frontier garrisons, and he knew his own value as a symbol. The men who served under him were professionals of the Croatian and Hungarian military frontier. soldiers who had grown up raiding and being raided, who understood siege warfare not from manuals, but from the smell of burning palisades. They knew what was coming. They chose to stay. Meanwhile, at the imperial camp, Maximilian convened another council. The debate circled the same ground it had circled for weeks. The emperor's senior commanders could not agree on whether to march, where to march, or what to do upon arrival. The army grew larger and more idle. Supplies accumulated and were consumed. Letters continued south. In Szigetvár, the last supply wagons that would ever reach the fortress had already arrived. The gates were being reinforced. Along the outer palisades of the old town, Zrinji's men checked their arquebuses, counted their powder charges, and watched the tree line to the south, where Ottoman scouts had been sighted for days. The sound had not yet begun. No cannon, no drums, no trumpets. But the dust was visible now, a brown haze above the summer canopy, the unmistakable signature of 100,000 men closing the final miles. Zrinji had his answer from Vienna. It was silence. And silence on the military frontier had only ever meant one thing. The dust resolved into men on the 5th of August. Ottoman advance units emerged from the southern tree line and began spreading across the terrain surrounding Szigetvár in a practiced choreography that had consumed cities from Belgrade to Baghdad. The vanguard secured the high ground to the south and east while engineers surveyed the marshland, probing for firm earth where gun platforms could be raised. Behind them, the main body of the army continued arriving for 2 full days, a column so long that its tail was still on the march road when its head had already begun digging trenches. The deployment followed Ottoman siege doctrine with textbook precision. Artillery batteries were established on elevated ground at distances of roughly 300 to 400 paces from the outer palisades of the old town, close enough for the heavy bombards to strike with accuracy, far enough to complicate counter-battery fire from the garrison's lighter guns. Ottoman sources record that over 300 cannon of various calibers were brought to bear during the siege, though not all were emplaced in these first days. The largest pieces, massive bronze bombards capable of hurling stone balls weighing several hundred pounds, required timber platforms sunk into the marshy ground and reinforced with fascines and packed earth. Gangs of labourers worked through the nights of the 5th and 6th, and the sound of hammering and sawing carried across the water to the defenders on the walls. Zrinji's garrison had used the final days before contact to flood what ground they could, opening sluice channels from the Almaz Creek to widen the marshland on the fortress's southern and eastern approaches. The water was shallow, nowhere more than waist-deep in most places, but it turned firm meadow into sucking mud that no cavalry could cross and no gun carriage could traverse without sinking. This was Szigetvár's ancient advantage, not the height of its walls, which were modest, but the wetness of its feet. On the 7th of August, the Ottoman guns opened. The bombardment began at dawn and continued without meaningful pause through the daylight hours, concentrating on the wooden palisades and earthen ramparts of the old town, the outermost of Szigetvár's 3 defensive zones. The effect was immediate and devastating. Timber palisades that could absorb musket fire splintered under the impact of heavy stone shot. Earthworks that might have cushioned the blows had not been reinforced with enough stone to resist sustained bombardment at this caliber. Sections of the outer wall began collapsing inward by midday. Yet the defenders answered. Zrinji's arquebusiers fired from protected positions into the Ottoman work parties, attempting to push approach trenches closer. Small sorties, groups of 20 or 30 men, dashed out through sally ports in the pre-dawn darkness to sabotage forward trenches and spike exposed guns before retreating behind the walls. These raids cost men the garrison could not replace, but they forced the Ottomans to guard every trench with infantry, slowing the approach work by hours that accumulated into days. By the 8th of August, the bombardment had opened visible breaches in the old town's southern palisade. Ottoman assault troops massed in the forward trenches, preparing for the first storm. But the ground between the trenches and the breaches remained waterlogged, and the causeways that might have offered dry passage were covered by concentrated arquebus fire from flanking positions Zrinski had prepared precisely for this geometry. The first probing attacks on the 8th were driven back, with losses that Ottoman chroniclers acknowledge but do not enumerate with precision. On the 9th, the bombardment intensified. Additional batteries that had required extra days to emplace joined the barrage, and the old town's defences began to resemble less a wall than a ridge of broken timber and displaced earth. Smoke from the guns mixed with the mist rising off the marshland, reducing visibility to dozens of paces in the early morning hours. Inside the old town, the garrison worked through every night to repair what the day's bombardment had destroyed, packing earth into gaps, dragging timber from demolished buildings to shore up collapsing sections, positioning loaded arquebuses at intervals along the breaches for the assault everyone knew was coming. 5 days into the siege, the old town still held, but its walls were failing faster than its defenders could rebuild them, and the Ottoman approach trenches crept closer with each passing night. The arithmetic was merciless and transparent to both sides. Somewhere behind the gun smoke, in the imperial tent on the hillside, Suleiman received reports of progress measured in paces gained and palisades collapsed. Somewhere behind the shattered timbers, Zrinski measured the same progress in hours purchased and powder remaining. By the 10th of August, the Ottoman guns had done what Ottoman guns always did. They had turned geometry into rubble. The old town's southern palisade, never more than double-layered oak packed with earth, had been reduced along a 60-pace stretch to a slope of splintered timber and loose fill that a man could climb without using his hands. The approach trenches now terminated fewer than 40 paces from the breach, close enough for the defenders to hear the sappers' mattocks working beneath the ground. Mining decided the next phase. Ottoman engineers drove shafts under the remaining intact sections of the old town wall, packing the galleries with powder. On the 11th of August, the first mine detonated beneath the southwestern corner, collapsing a section of palisade and the fighting platform above it. A second mine followed within hours against the eastern face. The twin explosions opened the old town like a broken crate, and assault columns of janissaries poured through before the dust had settled. Zrinski's garrison fought at the breaches with arquebuses fired at contact distance and with swords in the choking haze. But the mathematics had shifted. The perimeter was too wide, the gaps too many, the defenders too few to hold every opening simultaneously. What followed over the next 3 days was a fighting withdrawal conducted with extraordinary discipline. Zrinski did not attempt to hold the entire old town. Instead, he contracted his line toward the causeway connecting the old town to the new town, the single narrow land bridge, perhaps 8 paces wide, that crossed the flooded marshland between the two defensive zones. Every building between the breaches and the causeway became a temporary strong point, Defenders barricaded doorways, fired from upper windows, and fell back structure by structure, forcing the Ottomans to clear each position individually. The tactic was not designed to save the old town. It was designed to make the Ottomans spend days taking what their mines had already broken open. By the 14th of August, the garrison had pulled entirely across the causeway into the new town. Behind them, they left fire. Zrinji's men set alight what remained of the old town's wooden structures, denying the Ottomans shelter and forcing them to establish new positions in a landscape of ash and collapsed beams. The causeway itself became the new front line, too narrow for the Ottomans to bring their numerical advantage to bear, swept by arquebus fire from the new town's walls on both flanks. Ottoman engineers responded with characteristic method. They began filling sections of the marsh with fascines, earth, and debris from the destroyed old town, attempting to widen the approach and create additional crossing points. Sipahi cavalry, useless in the siege itself, were set to hauling material. Thousands of laborers worked under covering fire from repositioned batteries. The process consumed days, the 15th, the 16th, the 17th, each one a small victory for the garrison measured not in ground held, but in hours drained from the campaign calendar. The cost to both sides was severe. Ottoman chronicles record that assaults on the causeway during this period were repulsed repeatedly, with attacking columns compressed into a killing corridor, where the defenders' limited firepower achieved disproportionate effect. Zrinji's garrison, however, could not replace its losses. Every man who fell on the new town ramparts or at the causeway barricades subtracted from a number that had no reinforcement behind it. By the 19th of August, when the old town had been fully secured and Ottoman batteries were being repositioned to bear on the new town walls, the garrison had spent 6 days extracting a price for ground that the mines had already condemned. 6 days. In the calculus of frontier defense, where the entire strategic purpose of a fortress was to convert space into time, 6 days was a significant purchase. The campaign season shortened by nearly a week. The roads toward Vienna grew no shorter, but the autumn grew closer. In the imperial tent on the hillside, reports of progress continued to arrive, but progress now carried a different weight. The fortress that was supposed to fall in days had already consumed 2 weeks, and 2 full defensive perimeters still lay ahead, each smaller, each more compressed, each requiring the same grinding expenditure of men and ammunition to reduce. The Ottoman war machine was performing exactly as designed. The question was whether the calendar would permit it to finish. The new town was smaller than the old town, and that was both its weakness and its temporary strength. The defensive perimeter that Zrinji's garrison now held measured roughly 300 paces across at its widest point, bounded on 3 sides by the marshland of the Almas Creek, and connected to the Ottoman-held Old Town by the same causeway that the defenders had fought across during their retreat. The palisades here were timber and packed earth, reinforced where possible with fascines and whatever stone the garrison had stockpiled in the months before the siege. Ottoman guns began repositioning on the 20th of August, dragging batteries forward into the ruins of the old town to establish new firing lines at ranges that had shortened dramatically. Where the bombardment of the outer perimeter had begun at distances of 300 or more paces, the guns now opened at less than 150. The effect was immediate. Timber that might have absorbed a ball at longer range splintered and collapsed under the concentrated fire of heavy siege pieces, whose crews had spent 2 weeks calibrating their aim. Zrini's answer was movement. Between the 20th and 26th of August, the garrison launched at least 5 documented sorties through the new town's gates, striking at Ottoman work parties, sappers advancing their trenches, and gun positions still being emplaced. These were not the massed counter-attacks of a garrison with reserves to spare. They were raids of 50 to 80 men, timed for the hours before dawn or the confused interval of dusk, designed to destroy what the Ottomans had built during the day and force them to rebuild under the knowledge that the next night might bring the same destruction. Ottoman chroniclers record the frustration of engineers who completed approach trenches only to find them set ablaze by defenders carrying pots of burning pitch and oil-soaked bundles of straw. Fire became the garrison's most effective weapon during this week. The defenders heated oil and tar in cauldrons positioned behind the palisades and poured the burning liquid down improvised channels wherever Ottoman assault parties attempted to close against the walls. Incendiary bundles were hurled from the ramparts into the fascine screens that Ottoman sappers used for cover. The marshland itself became a weapon. Zrini's men opened sluice gates and broke sections of the earthen dams that controlled the Almas Creek's flow around the fortress island, flooding approach routes that Ottoman engineers had spent days draining and filling. The water rose knee-deep across sections of the southern approach, turning packed earth ramps into mud and rendering one battery position temporarily unusable. The Ottomans adapted with the methodical persistence that defined their siege doctrine. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha directed the construction of elevated gun platforms using timber from demolished houses in the old town, raising the barrels above the flooded ground. Janissary marksmen were positioned in forward trenches to suppress the ramparts during daylight, making it increasingly costly for defenders to expose themselves long enough to aim an arquebus or hurl an incendiary pot. Mining operations continued beneath the waterlogged soil, Ottoman sappers working in conditions that later accounts describe as nearly unbearable, shoring tunnels against collapse while water seeped through the walls of their excavations. By the 24th of August, 2 sections of the new town's southern palisade had been reduced to broken stumps. Ottoman assault troops tested the breaches on the 25th, pushing forward in company strength before being driven back by concentrated arquebus fire and a wall of flame from oil poured across the gap. The defenders lost men they could not replace with every sortie, every hour on the ramparts, every exchange of fire across the shrinking no-man's land. Ottoman sources estimate the garrison's effective strength had fallen below 1,500 by this point, though precise figures remain uncertain. What remained certain was arithmetic. The new town's perimeter was contracting under bombardment, its timber walls burning from Ottoman incendiary shot, even as the defenders used fire against the attackers. The marshland that had slowed the Ottoman approach was being systematically drained and bridged. Each sortie cost the garrison men whose absence widened the gaps between the remaining defenders on the walls. Behind them lay the last causeway, and beyond it the inner castle, the final perimeter, the smallest circle of all. The calendar read the 26th of August. The siege had consumed 3 weeks. Autumn was 5 weeks away, and the sounds of Ottoman sappers working beneath the remaining walls carried through the earth like a pulse. That pulse was not metaphor. Ottoman sappers had been tunneling beneath the new town's foundations since the 20th of August, and by the 27th, their work had reached the critical stage where timber props held back thousands of pounds of earth and masonry, waiting only for fire to bring them down. The science of mining was among the most refined disciplines in the Ottoman siege arsenal. Specialist units drawn from the Balkans, many of them experienced miners from Serbian and Bosnian ore country, worked in shifts through the night, excavating galleries that ran beneath the palisade walls at depths of 8 to 12 feet. The tunnels were narrow, braced with wooden frames, and ventilated through shafts disguised among the approach trenches. At their terminus, the miners packed combustible materials and, increasingly by this period, gunpowder charges calculated to collapse the earth above and bring down whatever fortification stood on the surface. Zrinji's garrison knew the sappers were coming. The vibrations through the ground were unmistakable, and frontier soldiers understood countermining. Defenders sank listening posts, clay pots filled with water or dried peas placed on drumheads to detect the direction and depth of the digging. Where they could, small countermine teams dug intersecting tunnels to break into the Ottoman galleries and collapse them or fill them with smoke. But countermining required men, and the garrison's numbers had fallen below 1,500 effective fighters. Every man sent underground was a man absent from the walls above, where Ottoman artillery continued its systematic reduction of the remaining timber and earthwork defences. On the 28th of August, the first major mine detonated beneath the new town's northwestern palisade. The explosion threw timbers and earth skyward and opened a breach roughly 40 paces wide. Ottoman assault columns surged forward within minutes, the timing coordinated between the sappers and the infantry commanders in the forward trenches. The defenders met them at the breach with arquebus fire and hand weapons, and the fighting compressed into the narrow gap, where numbers meant less than footing and determination. The garrison held the breach through the afternoon, but the structural damage was irreversible. The wall on either side of the gap had been destabilized, and Ottoman guns shifted their fire to widen what the mine had begun. A second mine detonated on the 29th, this time beneath the eastern wall. The pattern was deliberate, multiple galleries prepared simultaneously, so that no single point of the defense could be reinforced without stripping another. Zrinji faced the arithmetic that every besieged commander dreads: more breaches than men to fill them. Ottoman sources, particularly the chronicle of the campaign attributed to the historian Selanik'i, record that assault troops entered sections of the new town on the 30th of August and fought room by room through the remaining structures while defenders fell back toward the causeway connecting the new town to the inner castle. That causeway, perhaps 60 paces long, flanked by marshy water on both sides, became the hinge of survival. Zrinji ordered the withdrawal across it on the night of the 30th, a controlled retreat under pressure that required the rear guard to hold the new town side of the causeway while the remaining garrison crossed in the darkness. Ottoman troops pressing from the breaches could see the torches on the causeway and understood what was happening. Artillery was redirected, but the narrow crossing and the darkness made accurate fire difficult. By dawn on the 31st of August, the surviving defenders, sources suggest roughly 1,000 men, perhaps fewer, stood inside the inner castle, the last and smallest of Szigetvar's 3 defensive zones. Behind them, the new town burned. Ottoman troops occupied its ruins and immediately began positioning guns to bear on the inner castle at ranges of less than 200 paces. The marshland that had once separated the defensive zones had been bridged, drained, and filled with fascines until it offered firm ground for artillery platforms. 26 days had passed since the first Ottoman guns opened fire. The campaign calendar now read the 1st of September. Suleiman, in his tent on the hillside overlooking the fortress, received reports that the final perimeter remained intact. The Sultan's physicians attended him constantly. The inner castle's walls were low, its garrison exhausted, its powder supply dwindling. But it still flew Zrinji's banner, and every day it stood was a day the army did not march. The inner castle sat on a low island, roughly 120 paces across at its widest point, surrounded by what remained of the marshland, and connected to the smouldering ruins of the new town by a single causeway that Ottoman engineers had reinforced with timber and packed earth. Its walls were not stone. They were earthen ramparts faced with oak palisades, rising perhaps 4 meters above the waterline, backed by a modest ditch that the September heat had reduced to mud. This was the last ground Zrinji owned, and by the 1st of September approximately 600 defenders remained alive within it to hold every pace of its perimeter. Ottoman guns now stood closer to these walls than they had ever stood to any previous defensive line during the siege. Artillery platforms erected on the ruins of the new town placed heavy cannon at distances of 150 to 200 paces, ranges at which even the earthen ramparts could be systematically dismantled. The bombardment that opened on the 1st of September was not the methodical reduction of earlier phases. It was concentrated annihilation directed at a target smaller than many Ottoman camp enclosures. Chroniclers record that the palisades shuddered continuously, that sections of oak facing splintered and collapsed into the ditch, and that the defenders could no longer stand upright on the rampart walks without exposure to direct fire from multiple angles. Zrinji's garrison answered with arquebuses and what remained of their own light artillery, but the arithmetic of powder had become fatal. Ottoman sources and later Hungarian accounts agree that by the 2nd of September, the defenders' gunpowder reserves had fallen to quantities measured in days rather than weeks. Each arquebus volley, each cannon discharge from the inner castle's few remaining pieces, subtracted from a supply that could not be replenished. The frontier soldiers knew this calculus intimately. They had lived it at a dozen smaller border engagements. The difference now was that no supply train would arrive, no relief column would break through, and the fortress they defended had no further perimeter to retreat into. On the 3rd of September, Zrinji convened what sources describe as a council of war with his remaining officers. The meeting took place inside the inner castle's central structure, a modest keep that served as both command post and final refuge. The question before them was not whether the fortress could be held indefinitely. Every man present understood that it could not. The question was what form the end would take. Surrender was discussed and rejected. Zrinji's reasoning, as recorded in accounts that circulated within months of the siege, rested on 2 pillars. That Ottoman practice offered no reliable guarantee of honorable terms to a garrison that had inflicted such losses, and that every additional hour of resistance continued to serve the strategic purpose for which they had been fighting since the 5th of August. The campaign season was bleeding away. Vienna remained unreached. What Zrinji could not know, standing in that low-ceilinged room on the 3rd of September, was that the man whose empire demanded Szigetvar's fall was himself failing. On the hillside above the fortress, behind the silk walls of the imperial tent, Suleiman's condition had deteriorated beyond what his physicians could manage. The Sultan, who had ridden to war at 71, could no longer rise from his bed. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha conducted daily operations with increasing autonomy, filtering reports, issuing directives, managing the vast organism of the army, while its sovereign weakened hour by hour. Inside the inner castle, the garrison prepared for what they understood would be the final assault. Remaining powder was distributed. Weapons were inspected and positioned. The palisade gaps created by bombardment were reinforced with whatever timber and earth could be gathered under fire. By the evening of the 4th of September, the walls had been reduced in multiple sections to slopes of debris that Ottoman infantry could climb on foot. The ditch offered almost no obstacle. The defenders numbered perhaps 300 combat-effective soldiers. Two dying forces faced each other across less than 200 paces of churned ground. One was an empire's army, vast and grinding forward with mechanical certainty. The other was a garrison compressed into a space barely large enough to maneuver a cavalry troop, holding a banner above walls that were no longer walls. The causeway lay open. The guns had done their work. What remained was the question of how the last hours would unfold, and that answer rested with decisions not yet made on both sides of the shattered ramparts. Those decisions began forming not at the ramparts, but half a mile to the southeast, inside the imperial tent compound, where the most consequential secret of the 16th century was already taking shape before the fortress question could be resolved. Suleiman had not been seen publicly since late August. Ottoman court chroniclers, writing after the fact with careful diplomatic language, record that the Sultan's health had deteriorated sharply during the final week of the month. The exact nature of his illness remains debated. Later sources mention dysentery, cardiac failure, or simple exhaustion compounded by 7 decades of life and 3 months of campaigning. What the sources agree upon is the trajectory. By the first days of September, the Sultan, who had reshaped the map of 3 continents, could no longer rise from his bedding. The imperial tent stood on elevated ground overlooking the siege works, positioned so that Suleiman could observe the bombardment from a screened vantage. Around it spread the administrative machinery of the Ottoman state on campaign: scribes, seal-bearers, physicians, the inner household guard. Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha controlled access. By the 5th of September, that access had narrowed to almost no one. Suleiman died during the night of the 5th, or in the early hours of the 6th of September, 1566. The precise hour is unrecoverable. What followed was not grief, but statecraft executed at extraordinary speed and under conditions of absolute operational secrecy. Sokolu faced a problem that was simultaneously political, military, and logistical. Ottoman succession law was violent and contested. Prince Selim, the heir, was in Kütahya, roughly 600 miles to the southeast. Between the Sultan's death and Selim's secure accession lay the potential for mutiny among the Janissaries, rival claims, and the disintegration of an army of 100,000 men deep in hostile territory. The fortress had not yet fallen. The campaign had not yet achieved even its intermediate objective. If the army learned the Sultan was gone, the siege could collapse within hours. Sokolu's solution was breathtakingly audacious. He sealed the tent. The Sultan's personal physician was reportedly detained or sworn to silence. A courier rode for Kütahya carrying the news to Selim under conditions of extreme secrecy. Meanwhile, Sokolu continued issuing orders under the imperial seal as though Suleiman still lived and commanded. Ottoman administrative records from these hours show no break in the chain of authority. Firmans continued to flow, bearing the Sultan's tughra, directing the final assault preparations against the inner castle. The deception held because the infrastructure of Ottoman command made it possible. The Sultan had already been invisible for days. His voice had not been heard in council. Orders had passed through Sokolu's hands throughout the campaign. The transition from a living sultan who governed through his grand vizier to a dead sultan whose grand vizier governed in his name required, in practical terms, almost no visible change. The tent remained guarded. Meals were carried in. Physicians entered and departed. The rhythms of the imperial household continued as though the heartbeat within had not stopped. Whether common soldiers suspected is unknowable. Later Ottoman chroniclers, particularly Selanik'i and the court historian of Selim's reign, describe the concealment as lasting until well after the army departed Szigetvár. Some accounts claim the Sultan's body was transported in his carriage with curtains drawn, the fiction maintained for weeks. Modern historians debate the duration, but the critical window was narrow. Sokolu needed the army to function as a unified force for one more day, perhaps two, long enough to finish what the guns and sappers had started. On the morning of the 6th of September, the orders went out for the final general assault. They bore the authority of a sultan who no longer breathed. Across the churned ground, behind walls that were now little more than ramps of packed earth and shattered timber, roughly 300 defenders prepared for what every man among them understood would be the last engagement. The Ottoman batteries resumed their fire at dawn, methodical and unhurried, reducing the remaining sections of the inner castle's northern face to passable rubble. Engineers checked the approaches across the causeway. Janissary officers formed their assault columns. Two command structures faced each other across that final distance, one operating in full knowledge that its end had come, the other operating under the seal of a man already beyond all earthly campaigns. The assault was set for the following morning. The morning of September the 7th broke grey over Szigetvár, and what remained of the inner castle was no longer a fortress in any functional sense. The northern wall had been pounded into a slope of compacted earth and splintered oak that an armoured man could climb without breaking stride. The water barriers that had once defined the island's defensive logic were choked with fill, rubble, fascines, the debris of 33 days of siege work, and the causeways that Ottoman engineers had rebuilt under fire now offered broad, stable approaches from 3 directions. Inside, roughly 300 men held a perimeter that could no longer be held. What happened next is recorded by multiple sources, Ottoman and Hungarian, though the details diverge in ways that matter. The core sequence is consistent. Zrinji gathered his remaining garrison in the courtyard of the inner castle sometime in the early hours. He had already made his decision, not to wait behind walls that no longer existed, but to sortie. Hungarian tradition, drawing on accounts compiled within a generation of the siege, holds that he removed his battle armor and dressed instead in the fine silk coat of a Magyar nobleman, placing a gold chain around his neck and, the detail that has echoed longest, the keys to the castle gate in his pocket. Whether this is documented fact or early legend shaped by the need for a worthy ending remains debated. What is certain is that Zrinji chose attack over capitulation. The gate opened. The remaining defenders, perhaps 300, perhaps fewer, charged across the causeway toward the massed Ottoman positions. They carried arquebuses for a single volley and swords for what followed. The distance was short. The janissary formations waiting on the far side of the approach numbered in the thousands. The volley struck. Then the two forces collided in a space no wider than 40 paces, and the mathematics of the engagement were absolute. Zrinji fell in the fighting. Ottoman sources record that he was struck by multiple projectiles. Within minutes the sortie was over. The garrison of Szigetvár ceased to exist as a fighting force. Ottoman troops poured into the inner castle, and then the fortress delivered its final act of resistance. A powder magazine, whether deliberately prepared by the defenders or accidentally ignited, remains one of the siege's enduring uncertainties, detonated beneath the castle's interior. The explosion killed hundreds of Ottoman soldiers who had entered the compound, and the blast was heard across the siege lines. Ottoman chronicles record the shock and confusion that followed, officers pulling men back from the burning ruins, the victory celebration abruptly silenced by the concussion rolling across the marshland. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, still maintaining the fiction of Suleiman's authority, ordered the fires contained and the fortress secured. By midday, the Ottoman standard flew over what was left of Szigetvár's inner castle, a smoking ruin on a marshy island that had cost the most powerful army in the world 33 days, an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 casualties across all phases of the siege and the life of the Sultan himself. The strategic consequence was already irreversible. September the 7th left no time for a march on Vienna. The campaigning season was spent. The fortress that Habsburg strategists had considered expendable, a minor obstacle on the road to the real objective, had absorbed the entire momentum of Suleiman's final offensive. Maximilian II's army, gathered but never committed, would face no test. The Great Western Campaign ended not at the walls of Vienna, but in the ashes of a wooden fortress that most of Europe had never heard of until it was already gone. Zrinji's 300 had bought with their lives the one commodity no sultan could manufacture: time. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha faced a problem no Grand Vizier in Ottoman history had confronted. The greatest army the empire had fielded in a generation stood victorious over a ruin, and its supreme commander had been dead for nearly 2 days. The campaign's strategic objective, Vienna, lay roughly 250 miles to the northwest, a march of perhaps 3 weeks under ideal conditions. But conditions in early September 1566 were anything but ideal, and Sokolu understood arithmetic better than anyone in the imperial tent. The numbers told a devastating story. Ottoman chroniclers and later Hungarian accounts converge on a casualty figure between 20,000 and 30,000 men lost across the 33 days at Szigetvár. The Janissary Corps, the empire's irreplaceable professional infantry, had absorbed a disproportionate share of those losses during the repeated assaults on the causeways and palisades. Sipahi cavalry formations, largely unused in the siege itself, remained intact, but had consumed weeks of fodder and patience. The artillery train, hundreds of guns that had reduced 3 defensive perimeters to splinters, had expended enormous quantities of powder and shot that could not be replenished in the field. The army that had arrived before Szigetvár in early August as a precision instrument of imperial conquest now resembled something closer to an exhausted organism that had won its fight, but broken itself in the winning. Beyond the casualty rolls lay the calendar. September had already begun. The Hungarian plain would turn to mud within weeks. Supply lines stretching back through Ottoman Hungary to Belgrade and beyond were already strained. An army diminished by a quarter or more of its effective strength, demoralized by the hidden death of its Sultan, and burdened by a siege train that moved at the speed of oxen could not realistically reach Vienna before October, let alone conduct siege operations against fortifications incomparably stronger than Szigetvar's wooden walls. Maximilian II had gathered perhaps 80,000 troops at Győr and along the Austrian frontier, uncommitted, fresh, and positioned behind prepared defenses. Even had Suleiman lived, the mathematics of distance, season, and attrition argued powerfully against continuing northwest. Sokollu made the decision that the campaign would end. The army would withdraw toward Belgrade, carrying the Sultan's body preserved in secret, the death announced only when the succession was secure. Suleiman's son Selim, waiting in Kütahya, would need to reach Istanbul and claim the throne before any rival faction could act. The Grand Vizier continued issuing orders under the dead Sultan's seal, maintaining the fiction of imperial authority, with a discipline that Ottoman court historians would later record with something approaching awe. Couriers rode east, the army began its long reversal. For Vienna, the relief was absolute and unearned. Maximilian had never marched to Zrinji's aid, never risked a field engagement, never tested his assembled forces against the Ottoman main body. The capital he was charged with defending survived not because of his generalship, but because 2,300 men in a marshy fortress had imposed a cost in time that no strategic calculation could have predicted. Habsburg councils had estimated Szigetvár might hold for days. It held for 33. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse after 1566, nor did it abandon ambitions in Central Europe. But the pattern established at Szigetvár, the frontier fortress absorbing the energy of a major offensive, buying time that translated into strategic paralysis, would repeat itself in the decades that followed. The age of grand sultanic campaigns, of the sovereign riding at the head of his army to reshape the map of Europe, ended in the marshes of southwestern Hungary. Suleiman had reigned for 46 years. He had besieged Belgrade, Rhodes, and Vienna itself. His final siege consumed the last weeks of his life and the last reserves of his army's offensive power, and it was fought not against a great citadel, but against timber, earth, and the will of men who understood from the first day that they would not survive. The withdrawal wound southeast through autumn rain. Somewhere in that column, concealed in a carriage, travelled the body of the man who had defined an era. Ahead lay Belgrade, where the death would finally be acknowledged. Behind lay a blackened island where nothing remained standing, where a powder magazine had written the siege's final sentence in fire, and where the keys to a castle that no longer existed lay somewhere in the ashes, carried into oblivion by the man who had refused to surrender them. The ashes cooled, and the stories began. Within weeks of the Ottoman withdrawal, reports reached courts across Europe describing a fortress that had held for 33 days against the full weight of the Sultan's army. Within months, printed pamphlets circulated in Vienna, Prague, and Venice, casting Zrinji as a Christian martyr who had sacrificed himself to save Christendom. Within a generation, the siege had entered the permanent architecture of Hungarian and Croatian national memory, and it has never left. But memory is not history, and the echo of Szigetvár sounds differently depending on where one stands to listen. In Hungarian tradition, the siege became the defining parable of noble sacrifice against impossible odds, a story retold in poetry, opera, and schoolrooms for 4 centuries. Zrinji's great-grandson, the poet and military commander bearing the same name, wrote an epic poem in the 1640s that elevated the siege into a national myth, blending documented events with divine intervention and literary invention. The coat, the keys, the final charge, these details hardened into icons. Croatian memory claims Zrinji with equal conviction, for the Zrinski family held lands and titles across both kingdoms, and the defense of Szigetvár is commemorated as a Croatian act of valor as much as a Hungarian one. The two traditions share the hero without dividing him. Ottoman memory tells a different story, but not a contradictory one. Court chroniclers recorded the siege as a costly victory, acknowledging the garrison's tenacity while framing the campaign within the larger narrative of imperial expansion. Suleiman's death was treated with reverence and discretion. The turbe, a memorial shrine, was erected near the site where the Sultan was believed to have died, and for over a century Ottoman governors maintained it as a place of pilgrimage. Its exact location was eventually lost, overgrown by orchards and vineyards as Ottoman control receded from Hungary after 1699. In 2015, a joint Hungarian-Turkish archaeological team identified the probable site of the turbe in a vineyard southeast of modern Szigetvár, recovering structural remains consistent with Ottoman memorial architecture. The discovery confirmed what Ottoman sources had long indicated. The imperial tent compound stood on elevated ground overlooking the fortress from the south, close enough for the ailing Sultan to observe operations, but beyond effective arquebus range. The archaeology corroborated the chronicles without resolving every question. No trace of the powder magazine explosion has been conclusively mapped. The exact number of Ottoman casualties remains a range, 20,000 to 30,000, drawn from estimates that vary across sources written decades apart. What the sources actually confirm is more restrained than the legend, but no less remarkable. Suleiman did die during the siege, almost certainly on the 5th or 6th of September. Sokollu did conceal the death, and orders did issue under the Sultan's seal after he had ceased breathing. Zrinji did lead a final sortie on the 7th of September and fell in the fighting. An explosion did devastate part of the fortress after its capture. The garrison of roughly 2,300 held an army of approximately 100,000 for 33 days, and Vienna was never reached. What legend added is also identifiable. The story of Zrinji placing his castle keys in his pocket before the final charge appears in no contemporary source and surfaces only in later retellings. The precise number of 300 survivors making the sortie is a rounded figure that became canonical through repetition. The claim that Zrinji wore his finest nobleman's attire is plausible but unverifiable, resting on tradition rather than eyewitness testimony. The distinction matters not because legend diminishes the event, but because the documented facts need no embellishment. A frontier garrison fought until it ceased to exist, and in doing so consumed the final campaign season of the longest reigning Sultan in Ottoman history. The empire's last serious thrust toward Vienna ended not at the walls of that city, but at a marshy island in southwestern Hungary, against timber and earth, defended by men who understood from the first morning that no relief would come. That is not legend. That is what the letters, the chronicles, and the ground itself confirm. The orchard where the turbe once stood is quiet now. The marshes have long been drained. The fortress was rebuilt, destroyed again, rebuilt once more, and today its outline is a park. But the 33 days remain, measured and documented, belonging equally to 3 nations, and to anyone who has ever studied what a small force can cost a great one when it decides not to yield. Thank you for following this journey through one of history's most extraordinary sieges. If these stories brought the past to life for you, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next time we walk a forgotten battlefield together.